Welcome, and thank you for joining today's session, which will focus on applying the science of reading inside of core instruction, targeting the language comprehension strands. My name is Wendy Brooks, and I am the K-5 Literacy Specialist for the Teaching and Learning Literacy Team at the Louisiana Department of Education. Let's begin with our mission. Louisiana students will have improved literacy outcomes through high-quality instruction and interactions by an effective teacher who is supported by leaders and families. We support this mission birth through 12th grade with a comprehensive approach that is built around 4 key literacy pillars. The first pillar involves the setting, monitoring, and communicating of literacy goals at the district, school, teacher, and student level. The second pillar involves providing high-quality core instruction coupled with interventions and extensions that are explicit and systematic. The third pillar involves teachers and leaders being provided with ongoing professional growth opportunities. And finally, the fourth pillar supports the engaging of families in their child's literacy development at all ages and stages. Additionally, we will take a look at our Louisiana's education priorities. There are 6 priorities in total, but today for our new learning, we will anchor ourselves in Louisiana's education priorities that focus on aligning your literacy instruction more closely with the science of reading and increasing your effectiveness as a classroom teacher. So how do we ensure that our literacy initiatives will lead to improved student outcomes? We must plan for an approach that includes 3 core areas, seen in the formula on this page. Effective practices will ensure that those practices are grounded in evidence-based practices that are teachable, learnable, doable, and accessible in practice. For effective implementation, we must consider the stages of implementation along with the implementation drivers, which considers the competency of the staff, the needed organization or procedures within a school system, and also ensuring fidelity. Enabling context requires that we consider the implementation team, which are groups of people working toward the same goal and mission through an improvement cycle. These combined can improve student outcomes. If you are seeing the same results year after year within your school, then we may need to examine which of these areas could be missing. For today's session, we will ground ourselves in the following essential questions. If you are a classroom teacher, ask yourself throughout this session, how will you apply the science of reading inside of core instruction so that you can support all learners? And if you are a literacy coach or a school leader, how will you support teachers with applying the science of reading inside of core instruction? After this session, participants should be able to identify strategies for applying the science of reading inside of core instruction, practice strategies for applying the science of reading inside of an HQIM or high quality instructional material curriculum, and practice making adjustments to core instruction based on the science of reading. So why the importance of core instruction? For foundation building, core instruction forms the essential foundation of knowledge and skills that students need to succeed academically and in life. Equity and access provides an opportunity for prioritizing core instruction, and educators must ensure that all students receive a common baseline of education, regardless of their background or circumstances. Time efficiency. Given the limited instructional time available, focusing on core instruction ensures that educators can cover the most essential content and skills effectively. This maximizes the impact of teaching and learning efforts within the available time frame. The majority of your time should be spent in core. And finally, prevention instead of intervention or retention. The goal is to intervene early and prevent future difficulties with reading acquisition. So what is the science of reading? We know that there are 2 main sections of Scarborough's reading rope, the language comprehension side and the word recognition side. However, within these two main components, we must take into account the strands that are interwoven into skilled reading. The language comprehension side of the rope includes background knowledge, vocabulary, language structure, verbal reasoning, and literacy knowledge. The word recognition side of the rope encompasses phonological awareness, decoding, and sight recognition. This is all information that you should have gained during your Foundations of Literacy training. However, we have included a QR code that can take you to just one resource that will review the information about the science of reading. For the purposes of today's learning, we will use Amplify CKLA curriculum to identify strategies that can align our core instruction with the science of reading. Please note that we're not advocating for the adoption of any particular curriculum programs. We are just highlighting some of the HQIM that we have observed being implemented in the field, and the skills that we are practicing today are transferable to any of the HQIM curriculum programs that have been identified by the LDOE. Remember, to address all strands of the reading rope, it's often necessary to select curriculum that aligns with both the language comprehension side of the rope and the word recognition side of the rope. This may require adopting two curricular programs that complement one another. For example, CKLA Core Knowledge addresses the language comprehension strands. CKLA Skills addresses the word recognition strands. And decodable text can help to bridge that gap between the two main components of the reading rope and provide an opportunity for immediate transfer of word recognition phonics skills into their reading experiences while building language comprehension simultaneously. So let's look at how we can align core instruction to the science of reading. Throughout this session, we will continue to review the knowledge and/or skills that are introduced in a lesson. There will be multiple that cover different strands of the reading rope within a single lesson. We will consider which instructional activities are designed to support student success with different strands of the reading rope. For example, using a graphic organizer to expand vocabulary knowledge, or building background knowledge through a teacher-led read-aloud of a complex text, or even just listening for sounds and words that can support students in phonemic awareness. We will also identify strategies for maximizing instructional time and decision-making within core instruction to address the strands of the rope with which a classroom of students are in need of support. We must strive to become critical consumers of curriculum in order to best meet the needs of our students. This process that we must think through in order to evaluate the science of reading in our daily lessons will support our goals. So here's the basic process that we will follow today as we are looking for evidence of the science of reading within a lesson. We'll start with the objectives or the outcomes of the lesson, and we will repeatedly ask ourselves, what strands do you notice? We will then move to the activities within the lesson. How is the science of reading developed in that activity? How will this component or activity help the students to become a more skilled reader? We will also look at opportunities for making adjustments to the activities as needed. For example, we may need to provide more direct and explicit modeling, more opportunities for practice, more multisensory practice, opportunities to increase engagement, and possibly more assessment opportunities. Let's start by looking at a lesson from CKLA Core Knowledge, Grade 1, Unit 1, Lesson 1. This lesson is focused around fables and stories. Specifically, Lesson 1 will focus on the boy who cried wolf. Let's ask ourselves, which strands of the reading rope will this lesson primarily address? How will the lesson objectives support the development of each strand? And are there any strands not addressed within this lesson? As I review the objectives, I'm noticing that they have to demonstrate familiarity with the new story. They have to be able to describe story elements such as the characters, setting, and plot. They have to understand that this story is an example of a fable, as well as explain in their own words the moral or lesson of the story. All of these objectives support language comprehension. This lesson is not primarily focused on word recognition. Let's continue to examine the language arts objectives for Lesson 1. What skills are taught throughout this lesson? Again, I'm noticing a lot of language comprehension goals, such as restating the moral, identifying the meanings of words, making personal connections about a time that the students felt lonely, and so on. Which strands of the reading rope will this lesson primarily address? How will the lesson objectives support the development of each strand? Pause the screen to review the language arts objectives and take note of your responses to each of these questions. Using this lesson from CKLA Core Knowledge Grade 1, Unit 1, Lesson 1, we will take a closer look at each of the language comprehension strands from the reading rope, beginning with background knowledge. Through your Foundations of Literacy training, you should have learned that background knowledge is the amount of information or knowledge someone has on a particular topic. The more a student knows about a topic, the easier it is to read a text, understand it, and retain the information. If a student is lacking in background knowledge of a topic, then the teacher may need to help fill those gaps by building more background knowledge. Let's put this into action. Pause the video and read this paragraph with your schema or background knowledge about lawyers. Notice the vocabulary that is used and make note of the connections that you make to this paragraph based on your background knowledge of lawyers. Pause the recording to read. Now that you have read this paragraph using your background knowledge about lawyers, revisit this paragraph and read it a second time. This time, as you are reading, activate your background knowledge as though Susan were a bride who is packing her swimsuits for her honeymoon. Pause the video to read the paragraph a second time using a different set of schema. Now that you have read the paragraph using a different set of schema or background knowledge, how did this change your understanding of the passage? Think about what this could mean for a student who has a limited set of background knowledge about a topic. It will absolutely affect their comprehension and understanding of the text. Let's look more closely at the language arts objectives from CKLA Core Knowledge Grade 1, Unit 1, Lesson 1, which focuses on the fable of the boy who cried wolf. Which of the lesson objectives will directly support background knowledge? Pause the recording as needed. I noticed the objective for make personal connections about a time they have felt lonely, like the shepherd boy at the beginning of the fable. By connecting a time that students have felt lonely to the feelings of the shepherd boy in the story, students are activating their background knowledge from their own feelings and experiences to connect to the character. How is this instructional activity directly aligned to the science of reading? Pause the recording to read this activity introducing the read aloud domain introduction. By prompting students to tell about the most enjoyable part of the school day, the teacher has tapped into the skill of storytelling that most students will have already begun to develop. Explicitly connecting their knowledge of storytelling that is already partially known to the new learning that fiction stories are stories that are made up from people's imagination will set the stage to delve into a study of fiction stories, including fables. How does this instructional activity explicitly build upon students' background knowledge about listening to stories? Again, by tapping on their knowledge of storytelling, they will then be able to learn about telling fictional stories, including fables, to teach a lesson, and so on. Now let's move on to vocabulary. Through your foundations of literacy training, you should have learned that vocabulary is the knowledge of words and word meanings and how the words fit into the world around us. Vocabulary knowledge expands and deepens through indirect exposure and through explicit instruction. You may have noticed through reading the paragraph about Susan the lawyer that vocabulary was key to building understanding of the text as well as activating the background knowledge that you may have had. The vocabulary was also impactful when we shifted our frame of thinking to use background knowledge about the bride packing for her honeymoon. Let's revisit our language arts objectives for Lesson 1. Which lesson objectives will directly support vocabulary development? You should have identified the objective for identifying words such as lonely and chuckle that suggest feelings or appeal to the senses. This doesn't mean that these are the only words we will address during this lesson, but these are two words that we need to build understanding so that students can then better understand the text. Now let's review this instructional activity. How is this instructional activity directly aligned to the science of reading? Pause the video as needed. You should have noticed this part of the lesson where the students are saying the word shepherd 3 times, and then the teacher provides an explicit definition of the word shepherd. How does this instructional activity explicitly build students' vocabulary knowledge? This instructional activity is loosely based on Marzano's 6 steps for effective vocabulary instruction. Using some or all of Marzano's 6 steps is an effective way to make vocabulary instruction more interactive. So how could we adjust this activity to make it more engaging and meaningful? We could include a game or activity as one of our 6 steps, in which students are now interacting with a word such as shepherd. Many of our students may not have much background knowledge regarding shepherds and how they guard sheep and the meaning of shepherd. So once we are providing this explicit definition and opportunities for engagement, we can then engage them even further through an activity. For example, you may say to the students, clap 1 time if you hear something a shepherd would guard. You would then list 3 or 4 examples of things that the shepherd would not guard, as well as the one thing that they would guard, sheep. So for example, if you say trees, there should be no clap. If you say cars, there should be no clap. But when you say sheep, your students should clap to indicate that they understand that shepherds guard sheep. Research shows us that students need multiple exposures, as many as 17, to a new word before it will be stored to long-term memory. Notice that the students say the word repeatedly, they are provided the clear definition, and then they hear the word used in context. Finally, you can provide an opportunity by adjusting this instructional activity to allow them to interact with the meaning of the word and show that they understand the responsibility of a shepherd. This one part of the lesson could expose students to the vocabulary word at least 10 times. Now let's move to language structure. What is language structure according to the science of reading? Language structure refers to semantics and syntax. Semantics involves how word choice can develop meaning. Syntax involves the grammatical rules of a language. Again, this is information that you should have learned through your foundations of literacy training. Building a strong knowledge of language structure can help readers comprehend more challenging texts. Let's continue with this same process to analyze the language arts objectives that directly support language structure. You should have identified use frequently occurring conjunctions such as so to show reason and result, as well as build compound sentences using the conjunction so in a shared language activity. How is this instructional activity directly aligned to the science of reading? Take a moment to pause the video and read the instructional activity. How does this instructional activity explicitly build knowledge of language structure? You may have noticed step 3. By connecting a time that students have felt lonely to the feelings of the shepherd boy in the story, students are activating their background knowledge from their own feelings and experiences. Doing so can then demonstrate an opportunity to connect these two thoughts using the conjunction so. Also, be sure to notice the call-outs and additional resources within your own high-quality instructional materials. For example, this call-out explicitly outlines the importance of this syntactic awareness activity and how students can learn to create compound sentences using the word so. To strengthen the implementation of this activity and increase student engagement with language structure, the teacher might choose to add an activity such as mixed up or scrambled sentences to this instructional activity. Jumbled or mixed up sentences allow children an opportunity to practice and understand the structure of sentences, including the placement of nouns, verbs, adjectives, and other parts of speech. The sentences can be segmented by words, clauses, or longer phrases, and by rearranging the words and phrases, children can learn how to construct grammatically correct sentences. Using mixed up sentences is also an excellent strategy to support English learners. You may choose to call several of your students to the front of the room and ask each student to hold one of the phrases and possibly even the conjunction and the punctuation. You can then work with students to think out loud about the cause or reason, as well as the result or choice that the boy made. You can then work with your students to correctly place the conjunction between the two phrases or clauses, and then you may even take it to the next step and ask them to properly place the comma and the period. This is just one example of how you can adjust your instruction from your high-quality instructional materials to make the activity more engaging while focusing on language structure. Now let's move on to verbal reasoning. Based on your learning through your Foundations of Literacy training, you should have learned that verbal reasoning is the ability to infer and to find logical coherence within a text. This can include making inferences as well as analyzing figurative language. Verbal reasoning is often neglected because it is less easily understood. American idioms are one example of this type of figurative language. Idioms can be especially confusing for English learners and learners with limited vocabulary knowledge. English learners may struggle with idioms and other figurative language devices because there are thousands of them, making learning all of them as impossible as learning every word in the English language. They can also be confusing because of their very nature. Idioms are unpredictable, and meaning that the language of idioms does not always match their meanings. Now let's revisit our language arts objectives. Which lesson objectives could directly support verbal reasoning? Pause the video as needed. You should have noticed the objective where students are required to learn the meaning of the phrase cry wolf. Now let's look at this instructional activity. Pause the video and note to yourself, how is this instructional activity directly aligned to the science of reading? You may have noticed steps 3 and 4 of this instructional activity. It is indicated that these two components are inferential. How does this instructional activity explicitly build knowledge of verbal reasoning? Pause the video again to reflect. Notice that students are being asked to describe the shepherd boy's job, but then also explain or infer how the shepherd boy is feeling in a certain picture from the story, and then describe why he feels lonely. Continuing in this piece of the instructional activity, pause the video, ask yourself this question, and review your thinking. How is this instructional activity directly aligned to the science of reading? You may have noticed this part of the instructional activity in which students have to explain that the phrase "cry wolf" is used to describe the action of crying, complaining, or asking for help when there's nothing really wrong or when no help is really needed. This phrase warns that if they cry wolf too often, then no help may come when they really need it. This is a clear example of students using verbal reasoning to interpret figurative language. This directly builds their explicit knowledge of verbal reasoning through the phrase "cry wolf." And finally, we have literacy knowledge. Through your Foundations of Literacy training, you should have learned that strong literacy knowledge involves understanding the purposes, features, and conventions of texts. This encompasses print concepts such as spaces between words and moving left to right on the page, but it also includes all of the many text features as well as text genres. Take a moment to review the core content objectives from Grade 1, Lesson 1 from CKLA Skills. Which of these lesson objectives could directly support literacy knowledge? You should have noticed that students are required to identify that the boy who cried wolf is a fable. They are having to identify the genre. Now let's review this instructional activity discussing the read aloud comprehension questions. Pause the video to review this instructional activity and ask yourself, how is this instructional activity directly aligned to the science of reading, specifically to the strand of literacy knowledge? You should have noticed step 2, evaluative, where students are describing that a fable is a story that is short and has a moral or teaches a lesson, and sometimes has animals that act like people. This directly connects to the science of reading and builds upon literacy knowledge because students are beginning to explore different text genres. Now let's talk about some next steps for your continued learning. Consider the process that we just went through to apply the science of reading inside of core instruction, and reflect on your own teaching practice from the previous school year and the extent to which you already apply the science of reading inside of your core instruction. How will you apply this new learning as you prepare for the upcoming school year? What resources will you need? What are some ways you can apply the science of reading within your own HQIM curriculum? Some additional resources include the Literacy Landing Page, the Literacy Library, LIFT, Dibbles, and Setting and Monitoring Literacy Goals. As you continue to internalize this practice and apply your knowledge of the science of reading to your core instruction, you may have additional questions or comments. If so, please feel free to contact us at louisianaliteracy@la.gov. Thank you again for joining us for this session.